Every throne room has the same problem. It's only big enough for one chair. February 1983. Two men at the absolute peak of their powers, standing on the same stage, breathing the same air, thick with expectation and ego, and the chemical electricity that only happens when genius recognizes itself in another. The audience thought they were there to honor a legend. They had no idea they were about to witness the coronation and the coup happening simultaneously. Because while 50,000 people screamed their approval, two pairs of eyes met across 20 feet of stage. In that glance, an entire conversation happened without words. A question asked, a challenge issued, a line drawn in sawdust and spotlight. What security didn't understand, what nobody understood until later, was that they weren't breaking up a fight. They were standing between two forces of nature, and nature doesn't negotiate. Before we dive deeper into this untold story, if you want to hear more legendary music moments that changed history, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. These stories deserve to be remembered. To understand what happened that night at the Shrine Auditorium, you need to understand what had been building for the previous 2 years. By early 1983, the music industry existed in a state of strange equilibrium, like the moment before an avalanche when everything seems perfectly still. But the mountain knows it's about to move. Michael Jackson had just released Thriller 3 months earlier, in November of 1982, and the album was already shattering every conceivable record. It would eventually sell over 70 million copies worldwide, becoming the best-selling album in human history. But even in those early months, everyone knew they were witnessing something unprecedented. The videos were playing on MTV in constant rotation, breaking down the color barrier that had kept black artists largely invisible on the network. Michael was everywhere, his sequined glove catching light in 1,000 photographs, his moonwalk becoming the dance move that every kid in America tried to replicate on kitchen floors and sidewalk concrete. But in Minneapolis, in a warehouse that Prince had converted into a recording studio, something else was being forged. Prince Rogers Nelson was 24 years old and possessed by a vision so complete, so totalizing, that everyone who worked with him during this period describes it in almost religious terms. He was recording what would become Purple Rain, though nobody except Prince knew that yet. He worked 18-hour days, sometimes 20, sleeping on a couch in the studio when exhaustion finally forced him down, then waking up and immediately returning to the mixing board as if sleep were just an annoying interruption to the real work of creation. His engineer, Susan Rogers, would later say that Prince didn't seem to experience time the way normal people did. For him, there was only the music and the infinite variations of what the music could become. Everything else, eating, sleeping, conversation, other people's feelings, existed in some distant peripheral zone that barely registered. These two men, Michael and Prince, had never been friends in any conventional sense, but they moved in overlapping circles and maintained a professional respect that people who knew both of them describe as genuine but fragile. They'd met a few times at industry events, exchanges that were polite and brief and watched by dozens of eyes looking for any sign of tension or rivalry. Because the question that everyone in the music business was asking by early 1983 was simple and impossible to answer. Who was the king? Michael had the numbers, the unprecedented commercial success, the videos that were changing what music could be on television. But Prince had something else, something harder to quantify but unmistakable to anyone who saw him perform live. He had danger. He had that rare combination of technical virtuosity and sexual charisma and absolute confidence that made him seem less like a musician and more like some kind of supernatural force that happened to express itself through guitars and synthesizers. James Brown tribute concert on February 19, 1983, was supposed to be a celebration, a gathering of musical royalty to honor the godfather of soul on his 50th birthday. James Brown himself would perform, of course, along with a rotating cast of legends and rising stars. Michael Jackson was scheduled to appear. Prince was not on the official program. But Prince had other plans. Plans he'd apparently shared with no one, not even his own band, until the very last moment. What he was about to do wasn't just spontaneous performance. It was a calculated act of musical warfare. A public challenge issued in the most dramatic way imaginable, and it would change the relationship between these two titans forever. Backstage at the Shrine Auditorium that night felt like the green room of history. Legends everywhere you turned. Smokey Robinson was there, Little Richard, Wilson Pickett. Voices that had defined generations now congregated in hallways and dressing rooms, swapping stories and bourbon. The kind of night where everyone understood they were part of something larger than just another concert. James Brown moved through the crowd like a monarch, receiving tributes and embraces, his energy still kinetic and overwhelming at 50 years old. His hair perfect, his suit immaculate, every gesture sharp enough to cut glass. This was his night, his celebration, and everyone there understood the hierarchy. You didn't upstage James Brown, not at his own party. Michael arrived with his brothers, the Jacksons maintaining their usual formation, protective and alert. Michael himself seemed quieter than usual that night. Several people who were there remember it. He wore a red leather jacket and black slacks, simple by his standards, almost understated. He watched James Brown's performance from the wings, and those who stood near him noticed how intensely he studied every move, every spin, every perfectly timed split. This wasn't just respect or admiration. This was a student watching a master, understanding that every gesture James Brown made came from decades of practice and performance. That kind of effortless precision that only exists on the other side of 10,000 hours of work. When James finished his opening set, the applause was thunderous, 50,000 people on their feet, and Michael was nodding to himself, absorbing something, processing what he'd seen. Prince arrived later, through a side entrance, without fanfare or entourage. He carried his own guitar case, which immediately struck several backstage personnel as odd, because stars of his level didn't carry their own equipment. But Prince had always operated by different rules. He wore a purple trench coat despite the California warmth, high-heeled boots that added 3 inches to his 5'2" frame, his hair falling in carefully constructed disarray around his face. His eyes, behind tinted glasses, scanned the backstage area with what one observer described as predatory focus. He was looking for someone. When his gaze landed on Michael Jackson, standing in conversation with Smokey Robinson about 30 feet away, something shifted in his posture. The decision had already been made, but now the target was confirmed. What happened next depends on who you ask. Some people backstage claim Prince walked directly up to Michael and said something. A brief exchange that nobody could hear, but everyone felt the temperature of. Others insist there was no direct conversation, just that loaded eye contact that communicated everything without words. What everyone agrees on is this: Prince went to find James Brown, who was in his dressing room preparing for his next set. The conversation was private, but when James emerged a few minutes later, he wore a particular kind of smile. The smile of someone who knows chaos is about to unfold and has decided to let it happen because chaos can be entertaining when you're not the one at risk. He gave some kind of signal to his band, a gesture that meant change of plans, be ready for anything. James Brown returned to the stage for his second set, and the energy in the auditorium shifted immediately. He was performing "I Got the Feeling," moving with that impossible combination of precision and abandon that had made him legendary. When he suddenly stopped mid-verse and gestured to the wings, Michael Jackson walked on stage, and the crowd's response was seismic. This was February 1983, just 3 months into the Thriller era, and Michael's fame had reached a level that almost defied description. The screaming intensified to something beyond mere enthusiasm, approaching actual physical force. Michael and James performed together, trading moves, James showing off his splits and spins, Michael responding with glides and pivots, a masterclass in performance happening in real time. But then, during a brief instrumental break, something unexpected happened. Prince walked on stage. Not announced, not invited as part of the official program. Just walked on carrying his guitar, plugged into an amp that someone had apparently set up for him without anyone else noticing. And the building's entire atmosphere changed. The audience's confusion was palpable. Who was this? Why was he here? The sequined glove of pop royalty suddenly had company from Purple Silk Rebellion, and the two men, Michael Jackson and Prince, were now standing on the same stage, with James Brown between them, watching to see what would happen next. Prince didn't wait for permission. He launched into a guitar solo, something aggressive and technically complex, the kind of playing that announces very clearly, "I can do things you cannot do." His fingers moved across the fretboard with supernatural speed, pulling sounds from the instrument that seemed to come from some other dimension. He bent notes until they screamed, hammered out rhythms that shouldn't have been possible, all while staring directly at Michael Jackson with an expression that everyone who saw it describes the same way: challenge. This wasn't just music. This was a gauntlet thrown down in front of 50,000 witnesses. Michael's response was immediate and perfect. He couldn't match Prince on guitar, nobody could that night. But he had his own weapons. He started dancing, movement so precise and fluid that it looked like computer animation before computer animation existed. He spun, froze in impossible poses, then exploded into motion again, his body becoming rhythm made visible. The audience was losing their minds, unable to process what they were watching. Two entirely different kinds of genius, operating at maximum capacity, neither willing to concede an inch of territory. James Brown stood between them, conducting this chaos like a maestro, grinning wider with each passing second because he understood exactly what was happening. His 50th birthday party had just become the most legendary battle in music history. What happened next is where accounts start to diverge wildly, where memory and myth begin to blur together in ways that make reconstructing objective truth nearly impossible. But certain facts remain consistent across multiple witnesses. Prince, still playing that searing guitar solo, began moving closer to Michael, each step deliberate, his playing getting louder and more aggressive. Michael held his ground, dancing harder, faster, every gesture sharp enough to cut. The distance between them closed from 20 feet to 15, then 10. James Brown was still on stage but had backed away slightly, giving them room, understanding that this moment belonged to them now. Then Prince did something that nobody had anticipated. He stopped playing, let the guitar hang from his strap, and extended his hand toward Michael. Not a friendly handshake gesture. A challenge. The kind of hand extension that means, let's see what you've got. The subtext was clear to everyone in the building. Michael could accept the challenge, engage in whatever battle Prince was proposing, or he could back down in front of 50,000 people and millions more who would hear about this tomorrow. Michael Jackson, the man who'd spent his entire life performing, who'd been on stage since he was 5 years old, who understood showmanship and crowd dynamics better than almost anyone alive, made a choice. He smiled, that famous Michael Jackson smile that had been photographed 10 million times, and shook his head. No, not tonight. Not like this. He turned and walked off stage, his brothers following immediately, protective and alert. The crowd's reaction was confusion mixed with disappointment. What just happened? Why did Michael leave? For those closest to the stage, the musicians and industry people who understood the unspoken language of what had just occurred, knew exactly what happened. Prince had challenged the king, and the king had chosen not to engage, which, depending on your perspective, was either wisdom or retreat. Security did intervene, but not in the way the story often gets retold. They didn't physically separate Prince and Michael, because Michael had already left. What they did do was approach Prince, who was still on stage, still holding his guitar, expression unreadable behind his tinted glasses, and suggested firmly that it was time for him to exit as well. The way security personnel describe it, Prince seemed almost surprised, as if he'd been in some kind of trance and was just now returning to normal consciousness. He unplugged his guitar, handed it to one of James Brown's roadies, and walked off stage without a word to anyone. Backstage was chaos. Michael Jackson was already in his dressing room with the door closed, his brothers standing guard outside, not letting anyone in. The consensus among those trying to make sense of what had just happened was shock mixed with a strange kind of exhilaration. They'd just witnessed something unprecedented, a public challenge between two of the biggest stars in the world. And nobody knew what the consequences would be. Music industry executives were already on phones, calling managers and publicists, trying to control the narrative before it spun into something that could damage careers and reputations. Because while the moment had been electrifying, it had also been reckless and unpredictable. Exactly the kind of spontaneous combustion that record labels spend millions trying to prevent. Prince's camp had no comment. Prince himself disappeared into the Los Angeles night without speaking to press or industry people, or even his own band members, who were left to pack up equipment and wonder what their boss had just done and why. Years later, members of his band would say that Prince never explained his reasoning, never addressed that night directly, but the message was implicit in everything that came after. He'd made his statement. He'd issued his challenge. And if Michael Jackson wasn't going to respond on stage that night, then Prince would respond through the only language that really mattered: the music. What unfolded over the next several years was one of the most productive rivalries in music history. In June of 1984, just 16 months after that February night at the Shrine Auditorium, Prince released Purple Rain. The album was seismic, a perfect fusion of rock and funk and pop that sold over 25 million copies and spent 24 consecutive weeks at #1 on the Billboard chart. The accompanying film turned Prince into not just a musician, but a cultural phenomenon. His androgynous image and sexual fluidity challenging every convention about what a male rock star could be. Critics who had dismissed him as a thriller pretender were suddenly calling him the most important artist of his generation. Michael's response was Bad, released in 1987, an album that sold over 35 million copies and produced 5 #1 singles. The title itself seemed like a response to Prince's challenge, Michael reclaiming aggression and edge that some critics claimed he'd lost in his pursuit of universal appeal. The videos were darker, more confrontational. Michael's dance moves became more aggressive. The short film for Bad, directed by Martin Scorsese, showed Michael in leather and buckles, an image miles away from the innocent charm of the Thriller era. They never performed together again. In industry circles, the story of that February night became legend. Details embellished and distorted with each retelling until it was hard to separate what actually happened from what people believed had happened. Some versions had Prince and Michael in a physical altercation backstage, which never occurred. Other versions had James Brown orchestrating the entire confrontation as some kind of test, which seems unlikely given his surprise at Prince's appearance. The truth, as always, was messier and more complicated than the myths. What often gets lost in discussions of that night is the human element beneath the legendary confrontation. These weren't just icons battling for supremacy. They were young men, both in their 20s, both carrying the weight of extraordinary talent and the isolation that comes with being fundamentally different from everyone around you. Michael Jackson, despite his massive fame, was by all accounts deeply lonely, struggling with the expectations and pressures that had been placed on him since childhood. Prince, for all his confidence and bravado, was equally isolated, trusting almost no one, maintaining control over every aspect of his career because letting anyone else in felt like vulnerability he couldn't afford. In later years, after Michael's death in 2009, Prince gave one of his rare interviews where he addressed their relationship. He didn't talk about that night at the Shrine Auditorium directly, but he said something revealing. He said that he and Michael were the only two people who understood what the other was going through. The specific pressure and weirdness of being that level of famous, that level of talented, that level of scrutinized. And because they understood each other so completely, because they were the only mirrors that could reflect back an accurate image, they couldn't be friends. The mirror was too threatening, the reflection too honest. Looking back now, more than 40 years after that February night, what stands out isn't the confrontation itself, but what it represented. Two different philosophies of art and fame colliding in real time. Michael represented Polish and universal appeal, the artist who wanted everyone to love him and worked tirelessly to make that possible. Prince represented danger and exclusivity, the artist who demanded you meet him on his terms or not at all. Both approaches produced extraordinary music. Both approaches left lasting cultural impact. And the tension between them, the unresolved question of who was truly greater, continues to fuel debates and discussions even now. The throne room could only hold one chair, but history proved there was space for two thrones. They ruled different kingdoms, spoke different languages, inspired different devotions. And maybe that's the real lesson of that night at the Shrine Auditorium. The challenge Prince issued wasn't really about defeating Michael Jackson. It was about claiming his own territory, establishing that he couldn't be ignored or dismissed or treated as secondary to anyone. And Michael's decision to walk away wasn't retreat. It was refusal to play a game he'd already won by different rules. Security did intervene that night. Not to break up a fight, but to restore order to a moment that had briefly slipped outside the boundaries of normal performance. What they were really doing, though none of them understood it at the time, was mediating between two forces of nature. And nature, as we said at the beginning, doesn't negotiate. It just exists, powerful and undeniable, changing the landscape by its mere presence. That night, the landscape of popular music shifted permanently. Two thrones were established, and the kingdoms they ruled continue to influence everything that comes after.